some of our regular speakers back to join me today, and Happy New Year to everybody. We're going to be focusing this podcast on a weekly basis for our regular viewers. As you know, we have this every week, and we're going to be focusing our discussions really towards COP27, which, as we all know, is going to be taking place in Cairo at the end of the year in November. Focusing on lessons learned from COP26, main takeaways from there in terms of the pathway to net zero, and what are the challenges and issues that need to be tackled, before we get to COP27. What do countries, companies, governments need to be doing towards at least reaching COP27, and what do they have to have ready by November? And we're going to be focusing today on green tech, on green technology, as one of the primary tools towards that end. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Satyam Priyadarshi, Technology Fellow and Chief Data Scientist at Halliburton, Mr. Jean-Paul Sassi, Vice President of Loomis Digital Middle East, and Dr. Morgan Eldred, Chairman of Digital Energy. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today, and we'll get going. And we've also got a bulletin of headlines. I hope you've had a chance to have a look at those. But anyway, just some to help us along with triggering our discussion. We could ask you to choose one, or ask you for your favorite. But I'm going to start, Dr. Satyam, with you, and I'm going to pick number one actually as a headline, and ask you, in your opinion, whether you agree with that headline, which is that we need to be deploying technology and innovation, practically speaking, at more scale to address climate change. And where do you think the world stands at the moment from that point of view?
So absolutely, when we look at technology, you should look at technology in two ways. One is the operational technology, whether it is the energy production technology, so to say, whether it's solar or oil and gas or any other the technology associated with producing the energy. The second is the actual technology that is actually to monitor and make it efficient, right? So like that is more like artificial intelligence, data-driven innovation, then of course using of some other emerging technologies like augmented and virtual reality for reducing the footprint. So any of these technologies, whether it is operational or whether it is the optimizers, as I call them, we really need to put them at scale for really to be beneficial. And so in fact, that headline is a very good headline, because people have been using, so for example, artificial intelligence algorithms, people have been using in all industries, whether it's renewable or in wind or oil and gas, but they've only used it in a very small section, and it doesn't help us to optimize anything. So when we use these technologies at scale, then you can automate, you can optimize, and then you can innovate in a continuous cycle. And that will actually help you reach net zero in some cases, maybe even before the targets have been set.
Okay, well, thank you. Jean-Paul, I mean, would you, so what is, let me put it to you then, we need to be using these technology, the two sides of it, the AI software side, if you like, for efficiencies, and the physical, I suppose, equipment, structural technology solutions, as well, as Dr. Satyam says. Why are we not yet at the point where we're using these at scale as we need to be doing?
Wow, that's a fair point. Before I answer the question, just a few, we keep on seeing those numbers. I want to remind them to people that are listening to us today. To achieve the ambitious goals we've set for ourselves for the next 30 to 40 years, the 2050 net zero goals, roughly 80% of the technology we need already exists. 20% is at early stages or advanced R&D stages, but 80% is available. So fundamentally, to revert back to the question you've asked, it is a deployment and implementation challenge that we're confronted with, and obviously funding and capability development. So point number one, the technology is available. Why aren't we deploying it at pace and at scale? Well, essentially, especially in the energy sector, due to all the wrong reasons. We're a risk-adverse industry for the right reasons, but when it comes to technology adoptions, over the last decades, we have failed adopting leading digital technologies such as AI, ML, even cloud, at the pace other sectors have. If you look at media, telco, airlines, they are paradoxically way more digitalized than the oil and gas sector. Now that needs to be addressed and is a core enabler to reduce the emissions of the energy sector.
Okay, I mean, Dr. Morgan, I'll go to you on that point. Your company is very involved in providing these digital solutions to the sector. Why? I mean, you know, we can use this usual line of it's a dinosaur industry. They've always been slow to adopt change, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, for the last 10 years, it's been glaringly obvious what this technology and digitalization can do. And to be fair, you could say the industry has taken on a lot of those solutions. How quickly, Morgan, can the energy sector catch up with adopting what's available out there? As Jean-Paul said, 80–90% of the technology is there. Would you agree with that, first of all? And do you expect us to be adopting it more quickly?
So I put it like this. Yes, of course, we're slow to behind it. Are we 80% there? I mean, it depends. We don't know where we're necessarily going to go. I think what has happened now, which is an actual challenge to digital technology, is at the moment when we look at, let's say, the goals of COP26, but you know, so by 2050, the world has all come out and said it. But if we really look at it, most of the major changes are going to happen by 2030, where a lot of the commitments have been. And this is focused on 3 areas, right? One, replace, which seems to be the focus for everyone. Let's go into renewables. Let's go into wind, you know, solar, wave. Then second is let's do carbon capture. So let's focus on that, because that can get, you know, everyone sees those as the big hanging fruits. And then you've got reduce, which is where digital technology really can play, right? But reduce is less sexy than the others. It's almost like our house is on fire, and instead of going and getting a fire extinguisher, we're just focused on building a new house, right? Or putting out the fumes somewhere else. And that is a challenge. Now, if we look at it, and this was to the second part of the news, when we talk about ESG reporting, right? And this is really, really important, right? So the environment, society, right, and our governance. But typically for oil and gas, we're looking at GHG emissions. So you've got your scope 1, your scope 2, and then your scope 3. So by 2030, everybody is just focused on optimizing scope 1 or scope 2. So I'll give you a perfect example. I have an operating facility. I've got excess energy coming from my turbine that's powered by gas, and I've got an electric rig. If I power that rig, my scope 1 increases. So according to my goals, I don't want to do that. So then what do? Do I push it to scope 2 and get the powered from the grid, which could be coal? Well, okay, I'm now pushing it from scope 1 to scope 2. It's a little bit better, but it's still in my scope 1 or scope 2. So then what typically will happen, of course, is rather than doing that, I will move it to my scope 3, which is the supply chain, which has 11 times more emissions than scope 1 or 2 combined. When I put that to my supply chain, I say, okay, this drilling contractor, you know what? Don't even use an electric rig. Just use one of the old archaic, under asset utilized pieces of equipment and do it. And this is now what's going to be the challenges with digital technology, right? That we're not seeing at the moment, because everyone is trying to optimize their scope 1 and their scope 2. And I gave you a perfect example there, how digital technologies would be able to say, well, scope 1 and bringing it off of your turbine makes sense. But nobody's going to do that, because that's going to increase their emissions. And this whole GHG emissions and the scope 1, 2, and 3, this is going to be the new challenge to it. So yes, we can adopt faster, but like, we're still in this world where now the changes of the world are driving it, and they're not necessarily going to drive digital there without us truly being able to understand and optimize, and then be able to explain, you know, how you can do that, how you can measure it, right? You also will have the challenge between what one person's scope 1 is somebody else's scope 3, right? And how do you count for all of that? So of course, transparency is really required. So it's not about the individual technical features, it's about holistically, is it going to help us have more transparency? Is it going to help us model our economic strategies with our sustainability practices to have the right parameters? And these are where I think the world is really kind of moving to, rather than just like, yes, we can adopt digital technology. because
Yeah.
we can, but now there's a new set of barriers that are coming and challenges that are coming in the way.
Well, of course, one of those barriers, as you mentioned there in what you said, is cooperation, coordination. Everyone needs to be on the same page, which is pretty impossible, really, if you think about the divergence also of how economies are developed or not. And that was, of course, one of the key challenges coming out of COP26. Key criticisms is that the developing nations are still far behind because they don't have the funds, they have infrastructure challenges. The developed world is not doing enough to help them reach their net zero goals along with them. Dr. Satyam, just to you on that front, just let's look a little bit big picture on that point of what came out of COP26. I mean, we can get into it later and talk about the finance challenges as well. I'd like to get into that, but just from the fact that how does the world deal with these issues that Morgan just mentioned, of trying to sort of get everyone on the same page when you have certain economies economically, socially on such different development paths to where the West is, let's say, or to where Europe is. So how do we marry, if you like, the strategy across the world with those two different sort of tracks?
One has to really understand what does the bringing to the same page means, right? If you look at the actual complexity of the whole energy transition, right, it's not going to be the same thing that is same for developing countries versus Europe versus Americas, right? So in that sense, if you look at it, the consumption is different, the production is different, and as well as the desire to how much of that is less carbon producing or not is there. Now, if I usually use a picture for it, it's a very complex three-dimensional landscape with lots of peaks and troughs in it. Every country will fit into one of those local troughs, right? So they will work according to that. The goal is, if you look at the data from all these places, how do we really look at a data at the global scale, and then say which of these countries should move from this local trough to another trough, so that they can actually reduce or increase, whatever depending it is. So it's a balancing act, and that is the only way that can be achieved is by actually really doing what I call integrated data analysis. Right now, everybody's talking about numbers from different places. Nobody's really, even if you look at the report that they are supposed to put out, is not standard. So how do you compare and contrast, right? You has to have a single dashboard, if you want to call it, and from there you can actually make the right prescriptions for the right countries. Otherwise, it is all over the map.
Okay, Jean-Paul, let's just, if we look at COP26 from your point of view, and as we kind of work through the year now, countries work and companies in the private sector trying to support those initiatives that countries are taking, what would you say on the technology, the green tech pathway, should we be prioritizing before we get to November? What do countries and the private sector need to be doing to move forward, to make that particular meeting productive?
Well, let's start with the easy first steps. There's a few things, and again, I'll focus on the oil and gas industry, and I'll try to focus with the context we're confronted with in the Middle East. Obviously, other regions, other contexts, other priorities. In the Middle East, for the oil and gas operators, petrochemical refineries, there's a few easy steps to grasp. While certain operators are waiting for regulations, top-down regulations to be refined before taking any actions, we've been in discussions with a few slightly bolder operators that are already starting to address some of those first steps. Those first steps are Diala, the likes of leak early detection and avoidance, methane leaks. That has a significant carbon footprint. Well, in the case of methane carbon footprint, and can be totally eliminated with existing technologies with fairly minimal investments. Now, those operators are definitely leading the way and hopefully will encourage others to follow as regulations are refined and deployed in the GCC region, namely.
What about, I mean, we had, I think Fatih Birol, IEA director at the Davos meeting just this week or last week, recently saying that, yes, the industry is investing in clean tech, clean energy and efficiency. It's at about really 1 trillion, but this needs to be 3 trillion. I mean, let's talk a bit about finance and funding and financial resources that are going towards all of this, whether it's the technology itself or inter-country initiatives and funding. Where do you think this initiative stands on that? Is there enough attractive financial offerings out there to fund us to be able to scale up and get to where we want to go?
Well, multiple ways to look at it. A simple way, again, focusing on specifically the oil and gas sector, is with the current oil and gas prices, there's a lot of capital that is flowing to the sector. And that capital can definitely be used, at least partially, to fuel innovation. The challenge, Diala, is often to have those conversations when it's a cyclical sector, when the oil prices are low, well, the oil and gas prices are low. So now is really the moment to leverage the investments that are available. And I've seen this, again, to make that conversation tangible. 2021 was one of the most profitable years for most of the petrochemical players in the region. They've hit record profits that haven't seen for the last 2 decades at least. In 2022, they are investing in technology. I'm seeing this. There's all kind of ongoing discussions around that. That wasn't the case 2 years ago in the bottom of the price. So it is a good news, and it's addressing funding needs at a micro level. Obviously, without talking about government related funding mechanisms that are in place and increasingly supporting the energy transition.
Morgan, how do we go about de-risking the economies and countries that really are most in need of this funding and of these solutions? The banks and the financial sectors and even the companies who are developing this technology tend to shy away from countries that are rated, BBB or below, or whatever, developing nations, and kind of, it's risky territory, right? So how this objective one of them that came out of COP26 was, we really need to de-risk the approach to trying to get funding into the right areas. What do you think is the solution to that? I mean, what's standing in the way of that?
Okay, well, I think there's no one solution for this because it's obviously a huge issue. I think what I do see is if we look at the big organizations in industrial supply chain, energy producers who have a business footprint in these local regions, I think they are required and they need to start kind of having more of an integrated strategy in terms of how they are going to report what they're doing and the technologies that underline it. For example, it was mentioned leak detection, it was mentioned data analysis. Bring that under the kind of ESG umbrella and part of the transition. And then, of course, by being transparent with numbers and being transparent in locations that are there, if we start focusing not so much on what's your return on investment, what's my return on emissions, or as we like to call it, environomics, what's my return on environomics? How do we put that out there? I think this is something that's going to be there. Now, when you start thinking that 88% of institutional investors care about ESG and they put a focus on it, I think this is where it's the transition for people to have that almost integrated strategy, even just at a reporting level, is a way that can go there, because it will start to then say, well, now we can tap into the funds because, as an example, if I just do a leak detection project, okay, this is my savings, my asset utilization is going to go up. But if I can then start to model that and say, well, what is the emissions? What is the use of water in this? How am I saving that critical resource? How am I doing more with less? And being able to quantify that. And there's so many models out there. I think if we can get that, we can start to unlock the funds a lot more. But it does require the bigger players to take the lead on a transparent level that everyone can feed from that data set and feed into it.
Dr. Satya, I mean, Halliburton is a big player in the services sector. And we were just talking about how the industry has recovered very well in the last year. Arguably, the service sector is still recovering. You know, it was hit very hard in the last price crash. But you know, are companies like Halliburton, which are in that very important sort of supply chain, and scope 3, in a sense, they fit into that category. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, Dr. Satyam, you know, where do companies like yours stand in terms of, you know, rising to this new judgment of ESG principles, and is that changing your business model and your sort of attitude towards bottom line?
Yeah, so you know, that's a very good question. In terms of Halliburton, you know, we have been always being a good player in the ESG spectrum, and have been always conscious of our emission footprint, kind of. And I think I've been only in the company for 8 years, but I was reading some articles that we have been actually very diligent about it from a very long time, because we do support all the operators that we work with. So as a result, we have to optimize ourselves well ahead of everyone else. So in that sense, we have been always in that space, and we continue to improve on all the equipment that we have in terms of like reducing any footprint, carbon footprint that we have, and also leverage the digital aspects of it. For the last, I would say 6-7 years, we have been very much focused on leveraging the data that comes out, so that we can actually even further improve besides the science and engineering that we do on our equipment. So in that sense, I think and I think 2020, I think we announced Halliburton Labs, which is basically looking at the other energy sources. And even for geothermal, for example, we have been a big player in supporting the geothermal activities, I think over 20+ years or so. So I think it's been a good, as John said, like, you know, companies have had great profits in the Middle East, in the petrotechnical sector. Certainly that reflects on our companies as well. And certainly it has been, we have been investing quite a bit in that area as well.
Would you agree, Dr. Satya, I'm just staying with you for now, that in terms of adopting the right technology, investing in, from a country point of view, government point of view, that we've seen the GCC countries in particular, and some of the rest of the Middle East region, really take quite a forward step in terms of their commitment to try and clean up the oil and gas sector with, you know, investments in CCUS and other technologies, and really make some really serious commitments towards their 2050 targets. Countries like China and India have been criticized often for not pushing far enough from a government policy incentive point of view, i.e. they're not doing enough to get the private sector in to help with those goals. I mean, would you, and it's a big question, but would you agree that, you know, India, for example, and China, you know, the two largest consumers, are not, from a government policy point of view, doing enough to push this pathway forward, and not opening up opportunity for the private sector to help it do that?
I think your question was valid 24 hours ago. I think that budget was just released yesterday in India, and in fact there is a huge emphasis on net zero and achieving the targets, and the public-private partnership. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister actually went in depth to discuss that, and how they will actually achieve that, and what are the incentives they are giving it to the private companies to actually help the nation in achieving those targets, from both technology point of view, the finance point of view, the infrastructure point of view. So that budget, I have not read it yet fully because it just came a couple of hours back. But I think the Prime Minister and his cabinet is serious about it. At the same time, 2 hours ago, I was actually speaking to ONGC on their some celebration of their well logging center of excellence. And actually there was a discussion on this topic as well. And what they are doing is they are actually also focused on helping the ecosystem. As they say earlier, that it was a government organization. They were doing most of the work. They said, no, we want to have partnership with academics and smaller companies so they can accelerate the reduction of emission.
Jean-Paul, thank you, Dr. Ghazatian. Jean-Paul, Dr. mentions partnership, and I wanted just to get onto that a little bit today. Different partnerships models, if you like, that are being executed on some of these big projects, Jean-Paul, in terms of adopting technology in the sector. You know, in terms of the available models out there, I mean, is there anything else that can be, could be used more in terms of partnership models that we're not using at the moment that are obviously going to make things much easier to move us forward, or not?
Two elements I'm going to put forward. The first one is, yes, obviously, and we're increasingly looking into co-developing smart solutions, leveraging different elements of technology, and as importantly, data sources. You know, we refer to AI, fundamentally AI is a data-driven, are data-driven applications. Without data, those applications don't work, and the data is often owned by the operator. So, an innovative partnership approach is the co-development of solutions. Now, some operators in the region have started setting up separate JVs that are targeted to accelerate the digitalization of their operations. To name a few, AIQ in Abu Dhabi, JV between G42 and ADNOC, has the exclusive mandate. So, as an example, we're in advanced discussions with those folks, and I understand Halliburton is, Baker is, Schloom is also. So most of the players are starting to work with with a player that has the mandate to accelerate the digitalization of a huge company like ADNOC. The other thing I'm going to put forward is, a few days ago, we were in a discussion with TWF. TWF is the equivalent of Mubadala in Turkey. That's their national wealth fund. And as you might know, Turkey is investing quite heavily in petrochemical and the Gulf of Adana. Now, it's pure greenfield installation. They're starting from scratch now. And now the purpose is for those facilities to be up and running in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. The interesting bit is that they're looking at adopting some of the most innovative technologies upfront, working with the likes of ourselves to just make sure that from an early design perspective, the most innovative technologies are leveraged to obviously deliver more value, but more importantly, also ensure a minimum carbon footprint in their ambitious plans. Now, that wasn't the case 10 years ago. If you look at refineries that were designed 15 years ago and launched in operations 10 years ago, those type of dialogues were far more standard, and digital technologies were only part of the discussion towards the late stages, which is often too late to have any meaningful impact. That's it.
Thanks, Jean-Paul. Okay, Morgan, I'll let you have the last word. And I wanted to ask today about, the question that comes up at every COP meeting and comes up in every conversation we have about, net zero pathways. And that's about carbon price, carbon pricing, and the whole offsets strategy, and when we're going to get to a point where that could be in place, and how. So my question to you is, it's not there yet, and so how much of a detriment is the lack of a sort of global carbon pricing system to initiatives on the technology front, digital front, the confidence that investors need to be able to keep pouring money into these solutions, when at the other end, we don't have a penalty system, let's say, that's keeping things in check. Does that factor in?
I think it does. And I think one thing that we're looking at in the world is we're looking at, carbon offsets and the carbon credits as a solution. I'll give the example of the tobacco industry, right? So the tobacco industry, when cigarettes got taxed, the big companies didn't start, they didn't stop losing money. Governments got money from it. They were not necessarily the most efficient for doing that. So it was the consumer that hurt. What changed was when you weren't allowed to smoke in public places, when there was a big, health scare around it and a whole awareness. And I have the feeling that the current way of approaching carbon offsets is going to be the same. It's just going to be there. In my view, the way that we need to impact it is you make it per piece of product. So each product that comes has, from the supply chain, has a carbon offset to it. So you want to use this fertilizer. Okay, well, this fertilizer is going to cost.
But we have that. We have that already on food packaging, on other things. But you mean actually? So yeah, implement the taxation.
So where you can actually get that offset, because if you just go to the bigger players and hit them on it, they're going to throw it down their supply chain. Then maybe you go to the big supply chain companies. All that's going to happen is governments are going to take money from it, and the consumers are going to end up spending more. And that's where I think we need to look at where it actually goes where you can hit it in the consumer at a price level. Or in the case of tobacco, it's the insurance costs, right? Like, oh, well, now my insurance is so much more. Maybe I need to change. And I think, so that's awareness. And that's a more integrated approach than just going and charging the big companies. I know you have to start somewhere, right? So I do think by starting, you will do it, but starting and doing it means that somebody just might move it from their scope 1 to their scope 2, and then overtly to scope 3. It won't solve the long-term problem. That's my own personal view around this.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Morgan. Thank you, Dr. Morgan Eldred, Dr. Satyam Priyadarshi, and John Posessi. I'm afraid we've run out of time, as always, far too quickly. But thank you for joining us back on this first version of the Energy Transition Dialogues for 2022. It's going to be an exciting year ahead as the world continues to sort of try and work its way towards COP27, of course, here in the Middle East. So it'll be very exciting also to see how countries in this region also take the lead on some of the issues that we're facing. So thank you very much again, everybody, for joining us, and have a good remainder of the week. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.